Good afternoon, everyone. Hello, my name is Saadia Zahidi. I'm a Managing Director at the World Economic Forum, and welcome to this briefing on new frontiers for diversity, equity, and inclusion. I'm joined by an amazing panel who can tell us hopefully about the full contours of this issue and what these new frontiers are. Her Excellency, Dr. Rania Al-Mashat, Minister of International Cooperation of Egypt, welcome. Robert Smith, Founder, Chairman, and CEO of Vista Equity Partners. Welcome, Robert.
Thank you.
And Megan Greenfield, Senior Partner, McKinsey & Company. Welcome, Megan. Great to have each of you here. If it's okay, I will address you by your first names when we're asking questions. Great. And welcome also to our audience, the people in the room, as well as our live stream audience. At the World Economic Forum, we have been working on various aspects of diversity, equity, and inclusion for quite some time. And I think none of you will be very surprised if I say that the pandemic has set back the progress that was being made before. And the progress that was being made before was probably not good enough, fast enough already. And now things just got slower, and in some cases, they even fully regressed. And so what today is about, as we come back together here at the World Economic Forum annual meeting in Davos, is share with you some of what's happening that might help change things and put us back on a path to progress. And perhaps to kick us off, Minister Al-Mashat, you've been leading a public-private collaboration in Egypt that is focused at getting more women into the labor force, but also much wider efforts across the country, the type of public policy that can really change things and accelerate gender parity. Could you share more about that?
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Saadia, and a pleasure to be here at the forum. The first time we talked about closing the Gender Gap Accelerator was in a WEF conference in 2019. Little did we know that the pandemic was going to hit. Nonetheless, what is very important for countries is that gender parity is not just a public policy, but it has to also go all the way through the private sector, which all countries are aspiring to be the bigger employer. So that is one of the key attractions of the accelerator. The other important point in the case of Egypt is we work with a lot of development partners and international institutions. And as you mentioned, global trends today talk about inclusion, talk about skills, digital skills, and also green skills. And it's very, very important that as we are designing our own policy and our collaboration with international institutions to keep these objectives in mind, but also to try and collaborate with the private sector, make them aware of the public objectives that we want to move ahead, the statistics. And the other thing is to have quantifiable commitments. So I believe that this collaboration is very, very important. It started with a government vision, with a strategy endorsed by the president, and then the idea is how to move forward with the private sector, and this is what we did through the accelerator, public-private collaboration, 10 very clear objectives, including more women also at leadership positions, violence, trying to address violence in the workplace, child work balance, how do we do this in a practical way? So we have several points that we have agreed to through consultations with the private sector as well, and again, as we move forward, quantify those and push ahead, taking into account, of course, the different challenges, the pandemic, and also the reskilling that needs to take place when we talk about the green transition as well.
Thank you very much. You mentioned public and private collaboration. And Robert, especially in the United States, businesses have taken a leading role in trying to address racial and ethnic equity. Millions and millions have been committed, particularly since 2020, on this issue. Do you think we're starting to see a difference? And what do you think the best ways forward are?
It's a great question and framing of the number of the issues we've been wrestling with here. I've been actually quite encouraged because there is now a convergence of the idea that we must create a global system, not just the U.S. system, but a global system of opportunity that focuses on equity and inclusion. And I think what's been encouraging is I'm now seeing this permeate a number of the groups not only in the U.S. through Business Roundtable, but here, FCLT, the investor governors groups. These are, people who have been principally focused on profitability in operating businesses and regulation and of course, the decarbonization of the planet. But these conversations are no longer around racial equity and opportunity, are no longer just glancing conversations. They are actually spending a lot of time and doing best practice sharing. And some of the best practices that have been discussed over the last few days here, first, in order for this to be sustainable, it really has to be driven from the top. Sustainability with the tone from the top, and incentive structures for senior managers on the private side to ensure that they are taking their equity and inclusion responsibilities seriously, and their compensation is tied to it. Another thing was really, public-private partnerships. Not all businesses cannot do this on their own. They typically have some sphere of influence. I'm encouraged that many of us in our companies are working together, but there is a massive efficacy if you create the right public-private partnerships that can affect millions of people, and in the case of what we're doing with the Edison Alliance, billions of people. And so using that as a framework of public-private partnerships, informing each other on best practices, incentive structures for our management teams is critical. And the third thing is we have to engage with the communities that are affected. We can't sit in communities that aren't diverse and say, here's how we're going to address the issues of those in those communities. We have to invite them in the conversation. We have to listen. We have to be open, and we have to be thoughtful about solutions that address their needs. And by the way, create a feedback and feed forward mechanism as we tune it so that we can actually create a sustainable infrastructure and a sustainable system of opportunity. And I think most of the communities really just want opportunity to participate. It's not a distribution of wealth. It is really a distribution of opportunity. So that's what has been encouraging to me over the last couple of days.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And both of you pointed to some of what's the new frontier in the corporate space. How is it that businesses can truly drive forward equity and inclusion? And we launched here this week in collaboration with McKinsey, the Global Parity Alliance DEI Lighthouses. And what that essentially does is tell us who's doing this well. And Megan, tell us more about who is doing this well and how. What are the common factors?
Absolutely. We're super excited about the launch of the Global Parity Alliance. We've been working together with the WEF for over a year and a half to design something that's truly exceptional and different than what's already out there today. We focused on a global cross-cutting group. So that was one of the things we heard from companies is something that's different, is they want something that for multinational companies, because many of the existing solutions were very country-based, especially right in the US and other European countries. And so we focused on having participants across every continent to make sure this was truly global and inclusive. The second piece was we really wanted to make it beyond just one dimension of diversity. Many efforts are focusing just on gender, just on race and ethnicity. And so we specifically chose the Parity Alliance because we want to think about every element of identity. And you'll see in our lighthouses, while we have about half of them on gender, we have almost as many on social mobility. We also have things about neurodivergent. So it's a wide range of pieces. And so what we focused on was we identified 8 lighthouses in this first wave. It was a very robust program, so different companies applied. There was a WEF-appointed expert panel. The applications were de-identified and then selected. And we just have some absolutely amazing stories. And what we also did was looking at those, say, what really mattered? And very similar to what you said, is it's really about taking it as a business priority and making sure that you commit, from the top. To give you a flavor of one of the stories that's near and dear to my heart as a woman engineer is Limak. So Limak is a $4 billion company focused on infrastructure in Turkey. And they launched an amazingly successful program for girls on driving engineering. And to give you a step, so we have 5 steps that we identified as being critical for lighthouses. The first is a nuanced understanding of root causes. So when they realized that they were having very few women in Turkey actually enter engineering, they really met with the families, women, and communities. And what they found is those that had aptitude and interest in math and science were being steered towards medicine because there was a gender stereotype that it was not acceptable to be an engineer. They also identified 2 crucial stakeholders as women chose their profession, their parents and their teachers. And so both of these became central to the program they developed. The second is, which we talked about, is you really need to have the top. So you need to have meaningful and own definitions of success. So they said, we want to be the #1 institution driving women into STEM, and particularly around engineering. And they set that as their aspiration. And they started in Turkey, but they've expanded beyond to Kuwait. The third was from the top, leadership. So their chairperson, no other than chairperson, chair of the board, actually personally led this effort and made sure that it continued to be a top priority. Last piece is solution design for context. Building on this nuanced understanding of the problem, they focused first on universities. They have had now over 700 women participate in their university program, and over 80% of them have actually gotten full-time employment, and most of them have been in engineering. They then realized they needed to go earlier in the pipeline. They have now reached over 50,000 high school students in dozens of cities to really make sure that they get early on and can influence them in their trajectories. And they tracked this rigorously. So it's a great example of some of the lighthouses. Would invite you, of course, to read the full report, the 2023 DI Lighthouses Report, and learn about the other lighthouses, and join the Global Parity Alliance. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I will open it up to questions in the audience in a short while, but I do want to ask you one question myself. I think, Robert, you said, or Megan, you said that specific groups, but then at the same time there needs to be a holistic agenda. Maybe a question to Minister Al-Mashat as well as to Robert. How do we do both?
I think clarity on objectives and also creating complementarity between initiatives. And that's why the word collaboration is important. It's not just collaborating on ideas, but making sure that if I have, for instance, in our case, working with the World Bank, EBRD, USAID, and the private sector, UNDP, the WEF, each one has a comparative advantage. We all have very clear, quantifiable goals, but everyone is supporting, and we're trying to reduce redundancies. So I think that is very important. In a time where resources are scarce, and you want to push, either through establishing daycares or trying to increase capacity building or do mentorship programs between private sector companies. So some of the successful examples in one country can be replicated. So all of this requires resources, and the best way to move the agenda forward is if you look for these complementarities, and it only happens through transparent platforms. And that's the importance of the Closing the Gender Gap Accelerator in our case. It provided us this opportunity to be clear, have private-public partnership, have the WEF with us as well, because there are many examples that you've done in other continents. We were the first in Africa and the Middle East, and others followed afterwards. So I think this is, I believe, one of the key objectives, to be clear, but also to create transparent exchange when it comes to how to do things and focus on the comparative advantage of each stakeholder.
Thank you.
I'll build on that in terms of, I think it's, again, really important to engage with the communities that are affected. In some case, it might be a group that has no access to the opportunity, economic opportunity, participating in a company as an employee. And in those cases, understand what their needs are. There might be a social stigma, a cultural stigma. Understanding that, and then how do you architect around that so you can create more inclusive opportunity? In other cases, it might be you hear there, there's just no talent available. We had to address this issue with creating some racial diversity for boards of companies in America. And the point was, there weren't any people who were qualified. Well, one of the things we addressed and looked at was there are a number of retiring folks from the accounting firms that couldn't sit on boards. And so in the world I'm in software, you may not find people who are tuned in software, but they can be someone who's working on the compensation committee or the nominating committee or the audit committee. So we created a partnership with the NACD, created a set of curriculum, and now we'll be delivering into the entire ecosystem over 150 of these folks every year. Sure, our companies will take 20 or so, but the balance go into the ecosystem, and that's scalable, and it's something that's sustainable. And I think creating sustainable opportunities is really the point of this. And as you create that, and there's an awareness of the needs of the communities, and then you build the inclusivity part of it, then the stigma of what I call the other goes away, and then you actually create a more diverse, and then we all know this from the McKinsey studies, a more profitable company with that diversity of input. So again, understanding the needs of that community, unpacking that, figuring out the right partnerships, and then build sustainable infrastructure for that to scale.
Okay, I have like 3 more questions immediately, but I will take a quick pause and see if there's anybody in the room who would like to ask a question. And if so, please state your name and your question briefly. Okay, well, I get to ask my questions then. So I'm going to build off of this piece on, the business case and the economic case. And I think with everything that's happened over the last few years, I think many of us also very strongly feel the simple fairness case, the moral case around equity and inclusion. And yet, with the series of successive shocks that we're all facing, how do we ensure that this agenda is so much higher? Because it is critical if we're going to rebuild in the right way.
I have an answer to that. Again, statistics are important. McKinsey always puts out numbers, and all of us know that for an economy to grow faster, women have to be included. And I think when the word gender participation or women participation is macro-critical became more mainstream, it just means that as we are trying to move out of a recession or a downturn, it's very important to be mindful of that. And here comes, infrastructure for financial inclusion, so that if there are ways to mitigate impacts of shock on women, you're able to do it. If you are doing social safety nets so that you encourage women to take their girls to school, these are well-designed, targeted programs at times that are very mindful of this idea of pushing the economy forward. And it's all of us know now, and statistics has proven once and again that women are the most vulnerable, but when they are active, GDP goes up, and then both men and women are better off. So I think that, we keep on repeating these statistics. They have sunk in, and I believe that governments today, when they are, in order to have a compelling case to attract foreign investment or to have a compelling case to create partnerships with international institutions, you have to be mindful of that, integrated in your strategies, and that's the only way you can move forward. So I think the more we speak about it, and this has been very successful in the past, and we should continue doing this, and I think we should also be showcasing successful examples so that we can scale them, replicate them, and not reinvent from the beginning.
Megan, do you think that holds true for business?
I think it's absolutely critical. I would say I would add, though, I think you have to look at leaders and you have to engage them one-on-one. And I found every different leader has a different sort of motivation, right? So whether you make it personal with their family and sort of put it into perspective, if it is about competition, right, and getting best talent, if it is they're at the head of a BU and you're getting measured it and accountable, and they certainly don't want to be at the bottom. So making sure that you kind of use every influence tactic possible. Obviously, the moral and ethical argument and the fact that we have data, numerous data in every way, shape, or form that ethnically and gender diverse companies outperform. But I find ultimately it's about influencing the top leaders and bringing them along from wherever they are to illustrate that this is the right thing to do.
I'll build on that in terms of the business imperative. In the world I live in, we recruit what I call the scarcest, most valuable resource on the planet, which right now are software programmers. There's about 8 billion of us on this planet. There's only 29 million of us who actually write code for a living, and it is that code which is actually creating the acceleration of productivity, opportunity across the planet. We've been talking for 5-6 years about this fourth industrial revolution in this very city. But yet, in order for that to happen, we have to have talented, capable people. And for us to find that, we have to build institutions. These are centers of excellence in order to find talented people. Well, you can't just look at either one gender or one ethnic group or one class of people to fulfill this great need. And so as we open up our aperture, and hopefully everyone else does, we find out we get phenomenally talented people that come from every, gender, race, background, religion, and we just have to ensure that they have the opportunity to train and develop and become part of the ecosystem in our businesses. I mean, I run one of the largest private equity firms in the world, and we've been gender parity for years. And we take the responsibility that when we buy a company, we go through not only the economic transformation of opportunity, but a cultural transformation of opportunity, and that cultural change is to allow and create opportunity at scale for all of our portfolio companies, and that's what leads a lot to the performance of those companies.
That's great. Thank you. When it comes to metrics, there's obviously quite a lot of work already underway on the E of ESG, on environmental metrics, and there's quite a bit of debate around the social side of those metrics. How high do you think diversity, equity, and inclusion currently features in that space, and how much higher should it be?
You want to talk metrics?
I'm happy to talk metrics. I mean, the good news is people are starting to track metrics. I think there's two versions of tracking metrics. There's tracking them internally at the top leadership. There's then external. And even internally, are you actually telling anyone except, your top people? So I would say the good news is you've seen some, progress in terms of, but it's still quite simplistic, right? We're talking a lot about intersectionality. Very few people track intersectionality like groups. But the other thing is thinking about it in a different way. And I would say we're now getting into the next generation of type of metrics. Instead of just demographics, which is the most basic, but let's look at promotion rates, right? The Women in the Workplace research that we do in the US every year, we've shown there's a broken rung. One of the biggest challenges is actually getting people from entry level to manager. So one of the best things to track, if you want to improve your pipeline, is actually that you're advancing your diverse colleagues at the same rate as your non-diverse colleagues, right? So I think we're starting to see improvement. I think the key step is, though, we actually have to create full transparency across the organization, internally and externally, and then we have to hold people accountable. It can't be a nice to have. It has to be something that when they have their review with their manager, that is on the list.
I'd agree with that completely. Part of what we do is it's not just the metrics, but it's the accountability that's actually most important in the way that our senior management team vests into their stock. There is a component that is a DE&I component, and it's related to the job and the influence that they have, not the overall performance of the business. If you have influence on how much capital market activity goes to diverse managers, then that's what you're compensated against. And if you don't make those metrics in that context, then you don't get your vesting for your stock. And we found that when you align compensation and accountability, you actually get results in the business world. So that's how we think about it. I don't look at the metrics just as a nice to have, but it is an essential way of which our people are going to advance in their own economic interests in our businesses.
Thank you. Minister?
I just wanted to maybe conclude that it's very important that companies also showcase each other, and that's why through the accelerator we created this company-to-company mentorship. How do they do it? So sometimes it's some are more advanced, some of them already have these metrics, others don't, to show the benefits of it from a financing point of view. From also an output point of view. So I think this mentorship is not just on an individual basis, but on a company-to-company basis.
Let me give each of you a final question. We're here in Davos 2030. What would you wish to have happened by then on this agenda, since we are discussing the new frontiers of diversity, equity, inclusion? And Megan, I'll start with you. Robert next, and final word to the minister.
I mean, it's going to sound, like I'm just repeating, but to me, every leader here from every dimension should be accountable, and there should be a financial, meaningful amount of accountability for their performance on DEI. I think that would then translate into significant success and movement on this agenda.
I would hope and actually believe that we will have global systems of opportunity, and they will be well understood, and they will be available to be accessed, and they will be resourced in a way that citizens on this planet, if they have interest in participating in this economy, they can do it and not necessarily have to migrate in order for that to happen. They can do it in their home countries because each of their countries has realized the importance of creating sustainable economic infrastructure and leveraging their people, which is typically the greatest asset of every country, to participate and support the economic growth of those countries.
Thank you.
Judging by the past few years, we know that we are going to be hit by some sort of challenge between now and 2030. And I think that what has happened over this course of the different crises has created more resilience for all of us to be faster in thinking how to solve issues. So I think between now and 2030, I think we have enough to be creative in case we are hit by whatever global challenge shows up. Again, this is an agenda which is very high on governments, dialogue and discussion with the different stakeholders.
Thank you very much. I think you've provided us with a powerful vision for what we need to aspire to in the next few years. Thank you again for all of your comments. For those of you that are watching online, and if you're looking for additional resources in this space, please do take a look at the World Economic Forum's Global Gender Gap Report. Please do take a look at the DEI Lighthouses paper that produced in collaboration with McKinsey and Company. Please take a look at the ESG and disability data produced by Valuable 500. And last but not least, please take a look at the Global Racial and Ethnic Equity Framework. 4 resources that can be very powerful in helping ensure that we are structured and focused on this agenda. Thank you again, Megan. Thank you, Robert. And thank you, Minister Al-Mashat.